The wind howled across the barren land, a voice of the desert that carried grit and fire in every gust, and she stood in the middle of it with her eyes narrowed, the scarf wrapped tight around her face, and her hands steady on the worn grip of her weapon. To those who had laughed at her, who had mocked the way she trained, who said her aim was nothing more than luck born out of desperation, this was the moment that would silence every whisper, for the storm itself seemed to conspire against her, swirling dust thick as smoke, the sun falling behind the jagged horizon in a haze of red, and the target before her, a machine darting fast across the landscape, was little more than a shifting blur in the chaos. Yet she did not tremble. She had been waiting for this all her life, for the desert had raised her in hardship, had taught her to see when others were blinded, to listen when the storm drowned out all sound, and to breathe calmly even as the sky itself seemed to collapse in fire and dust. Each breath she took was deliberate, each motion measured, and though the storm tore at her clothes and filled her lungs with the taste of earth, her mind was clear, her heart steady, her purpose unshaken. Memories of their laughter returned unbidden, the cruel curve of smiles, the sneers, the careless dismissal of her skills as though she were nothing more than a girl pretending at war, and those memories no longer wounded her but steeled her, made her grip the weapon tighter, made her eyes narrow into the storm with defiance as though she could carve her worth into the very air with the strike of her shot. She recalled the first time she had stood before them, the so-called warriors who had mocked her stance, who said her arms were too weak, her eyes too soft, her will too fragile to survive a battlefield. They had jeered when she practiced long after sundown, firing into the dark when others had retired, seeking not recognition but mastery. They had called her foolish, wasting her strength on impossible drills, cutting shadows in the night with her blade, running through the dunes until her legs burned and her lungs threatened to tear. And yet she had continued, for there was no other way to prove herself, no path but the one she carved alone in silence. They had laughed then, but they would not laugh now, not as she faced the storm with eyes unyielding. The dust clawed at her, blinding, suffocating, yet she knew its rhythm, had studied it as one might study the currents of the sea, and she had trained her senses to read movement where none could be seen, to hear the faintest difference between the storm's howl and the whisper of something cutting through it. That skill, honed in secret when no one believed, was her only ally now. The target sped across the field, mechanical legs tearing through the sand with speed that mocked her humanity, but she tracked it with patience, not rushing, not panicking, waiting for the fraction of a heartbeat when the world aligned with her purpose. She had seen failure before, had tasted the bitterness of missed shots, of derision that followed, of being told she was reckless, unfit, unworthy of standing among them. But she had also seen resilience bloom in the cracks of her spirit, each insult watering the roots of defiance until they grew strong enough to anchor her even in this storm. As the machine blurred in the distance, she saw not just a target but a mirror of every challenge she had endured, every voice that told her she could not, every barrier that dared to stop her. And so she inhaled deeply, the breath burning her throat, held it against the weight of the storm, and steadied her weapon with a stillness that was almost unnatural, the calm eye of the hurricane that no one believed she could ever find. The sun dipped lower, bleeding into the clouds, painting the dust in shades of crimson and gold, as though the desert itself bore witness to her trial. Time stretched thin, each second an eternity, each heartbeat a drumbeat of fate, and she did not blink, did not waver, did not falter. Her thoughts flickered to her father, long gone, who once told her that the desert respects only those who listen to it, who bend without breaking, who learn its language instead of cursing its wrath. She remembered sitting beside him as a child, listening to the wind rattle the walls of their home, his voice calm as he said that storms are not enemies but teachers, that vision is not found in clear skies but in the struggle to see through the sand. He had believed in her when no one else did, and it was his faith that had carried her through the nights when she wanted to quit, his voice that whispered when the laughter of others grew too sharp to bear. Tonight, as the storm raged and the world threatened to vanish into shadow, she felt him near, not in body but in spirit, urging her to hold steady, to trust the lessons of the desert. The target darted closer, veering left and right in unpredictable bursts, its design meant to elude, to mock the limits of human precision, but she had studied its patterns for months, knew its rhythm as intimately as she knew the pulse in her wrist, and she saw the opening even before it revealed itself. Her finger tightened slowly, deliberately, and in that instant she felt everything converge, the laughter of the past, the defiance of her training, the wisdom of her father, the fury of the storm, the dying fire of the sun, and when she exhaled, she did so not as a girl mocked for her weakness but as a warrior declaring her truth. The shot cracked like thunder, cutting through the wind, piercing the veil of dust, and for a moment the desert itself seemed to pause as though holding its breath. The blur of the machine jolted, stumbled, and then fell, crashing into the sand with a shriek of metal against stone, its speed broken, its arrogance shattered. She lowered her weapon slowly, her chest rising and falling with exhaustion, the weight of triumph settling into her bones like warmth after long cold. The storm continued to rage, but it no longer mattered, for she had carved her worth into its heart, had proven to the desert and to herself that she was no shadow, no weakling, no joke to be dismissed. The storm howled, but she stood taller, unbowed, her eyes burning with the reflection of a sun that refused to die, and though no one else could see her victory in that moment, she knew the truth had been written. The desert would remember, and one day so would they. The machine lay broken in the sand, sparks hissing from its shattered frame, the wind tugging at its carcass as though eager to bury it beneath the shifting dunes, and she stood staring at it with her heart hammering in her chest, not from fear but from the weight of what she had done. She had silenced the jeers, though none of those who had mocked her were present to see it, and yet she knew that word would spread because nothing stayed hidden in the desert for long. Victories were carried on the storm's breath just as surely as failures were, and when the others heard, they would be forced to reckon with the truth that she was no pretender but someone who had faced the impossible and cut it down with her own hands. The dust pressed against her eyes until tears burned, though she could not tell if they were from the storm or from the swell of emotion within, and for a long moment she simply stood there in silence, feeling the desert's heartbeat echo through the ground beneath her boots. Her hands ached from gripping the weapon, her lungs raw from breathing grit, yet she felt lighter than she ever had, as though the weight of years of mockery had been lifted all at once. She whispered into the storm a promise to herself that this would not be the last time she proved them wrong, that tonight was not an end but a beginning, and as she turned away from the wreckage, the setting sun caught her face in a blaze of fire that seemed to crown her with defiance. She began the long walk back toward the outpost, her legs heavy but her spirit fierce, and with each step the memories of her past pressed in on her like ghosts demanding acknowledgement. She thought of the first trial they had forced upon her, when they had placed her before a moving target and laughed as she missed again and again, her hands trembling, her confidence shattered with every jeer that echoed behind her. That day she had fled in humiliation, tears streaking down her cheeks, believing that perhaps they were right, that perhaps she was unworthy. Yet that night she had returned alone, standing before the same target in the darkness, firing until her arms went numb, until her eyes blurred, until at last she began to understand the rhythm of motion and the discipline of patience. No one had seen her then, no one had praised her, but that night had planted the seed of resilience that had carried her to this moment. She remembered how she had sworn to herself that she would never let their laughter define her again, and though it had taken years of secret training, of quiet determination, of pain endured in silence, she had at last made that vow real. The storm shifted, calmer now as though acknowledging her triumph, and she felt the air grow cooler with the fall of night. Stars began to pierce the darkening sky, faint glimmers at first but growing stronger with every passing minute, and she looked up at them with a quiet sense of belonging. The desert was vast, merciless, but it was also home, and she realized that she was as much a part of it as the dunes and the storms, shaped by its cruelty but also by its hidden kindness. Her father had once told her that the stars were the desert's way of reminding its children that even in the darkest nights there was guidance to be found, and as she walked beneath them now, she felt that guidance in her bones. She could almost hear his voice again, telling her that strength is not measured in how loudly one boasts but in how steadily one endures, and she smiled faintly beneath the scarf that shielded her face, grateful that his lessons had not been lost. But even as the memory of his voice comforted her, another memory rose like a wound that refused to heal. The face of Kale, the warrior who had mocked her most cruelly, whose words had cut deeper than any blade, whose laughter had haunted her for years. He had called her fragile, useless, a burden that would only drag others down, and though she had tried to ignore him, his scorn had followed her like a shadow. Tonight, as she replayed the moment of her victory, she could almost see his face twisting in disbelief, almost hear the silence that would fall upon him when he learned of what she had done. Yet a part of her knew that silence would not last long, for men like Kale did not accept being proven wrong. They would twist the truth, claim it was luck, or insist the storm had somehow aided her. The thought did not frighten her, for she understood now that his voice had power only if she allowed it, and tonight she felt stronger than his scorn, stronger than the years of doubt he had tried to carve into her spirit. Her feet carried her onward, the outpost still distant but drawing closer with each weary step, and she thought of what awaited her there. The others would look at her differently now, though not all with admiration. Some would resent her for daring to succeed where they had wished her to fail, others would envy her, and still others would dismiss her victory as meaningless. She did not seek their approval anymore, but she knew the battle for recognition was not over, that this was only the first cut in a long war against disbelief. And yet she felt no despair, for tonight had proven to her that she could endure the storm, that she could strike true even when the world tried to blind her. That knowledge was a shield no voice could pierce, no sneer could shatter, and it gave her a strength far greater than their approval ever could. She imagined the moment she would walk into the outpost, the way silence would fall, the way eyes would turn, searching her face for proof of rumor. She would not boast, would not raise her voice to demand their recognition. She would simply walk past them, her silence speaking louder than their years of mockery. The wreckage of the machine still smoked in the desert, and she knew scouts would find it soon, bringing back word of her triumph, and the truth would spread like wildfire no matter how they tried to smother it. In that image she found satisfaction, not because it would humiliate them, but because it would free her from the weight of proving herself again and again. She had struck her mark, and that truth was carved into the desert itself, untouchable by lies. Night deepened, the storm fading into memory, and still she walked, her body aching, her spirit alight. The desert was quiet now, save for the crunch of her boots on the sand, and in that silence she found peace. She did not know what trials lay ahead, what battles she would still have to fight, but she felt ready for them, for she had faced the storm and had not faltered. She whispered once more to the wind, not in defiance but in gratitude, thanking it for testing her, for shaping her, for giving her the chance to prove herself, and as the stars blazed brighter overhead, she felt as though the desert itself had accepted her at last. The road ahead would not be easy, but tonight she carried with her the memory of a shot fired true, of a storm endured, of laughter silenced, and that memory would light her path through every shadow yet to come. The outpost lights flickered faintly against the horizon, a scattering of dim beacons barely visible against the vast desert night, and with each step she drew closer, her resolve hardening as anticipation tightened in her chest. She knew the moment of reckoning was near, the moment when the others would see her return and wonder how she had survived the storm at all, let alone returned with victory hidden in her silence. The desert whispered around her, the sand shifting under her boots, and though exhaustion weighed heavy on her limbs she moved with the quiet strength of someone who carried more than herself, carrying the burden of every insult, every dismissal, and every doubt she had endured. She imagined the faces that would turn when she entered the compound, the flicker of disbelief in their eyes, the uneasy recognition that something had changed. For years they had cast her aside, but tonight she would walk among them not as a shadow but as proof that their judgments were hollow. Yet even as she rehearsed that image in her mind, a thread of unease tugged at her, a reminder that triumph rarely came without consequence. The gates loomed larger as she neared, tall steel rising from the dunes, battered by storms but unbroken, and two guards stepped forward, their rifles gleaming faintly beneath the starlight. They squinted through the dust at her figure, their expressions hardening until recognition broke across their faces. One called her name with disbelief, as though expecting her to be nothing more than another ghost swallowed by the storm, and when she gave no answer but only kept walking, their silence grew heavy. They had seen others leave with confidence only to return broken or not at all, yet here she was, weary but unbowed, and that image alone unsettled them. They opened the gates without further word, letting her pass into the compound where murmurs quickly began to stir. Figures emerged from the shadows, men and women wrapped in desert garb, their eyes catching the lamplight as they studied her, some with curiosity, others with suspicion, still others with a kind of reluctant awe. She met none of their gazes, for she had no need to plead her case. The desert had already spoken for her. Inside the main hall the murmurs grew louder, voices overlapping like the buzzing of restless insects, and she could feel the weight of their attention pressing against her back as she moved. At the center stood Cale, his arms crossed, his stance wide, his presence commanding in the way of one who had long been obeyed. His eyes narrowed when they found her, and though his mouth curved faintly, it was not in welcome but in a sharp smile that carried the echo of old cruelty. He spoke her name again, louder this time, drawing the attention of everyone present, and for a moment the hall fell into silence. Then came his question, simple yet heavy, demanding proof. What had she accomplished in the storm that gave her the audacity to return with such calm? She looked at him steadily, her silence stretched thin until the tension in the room was nearly unbearable, and then she spoke at last, her voice quiet but cutting through the hush with clarity. She told them the machine no longer ran, that the desert held its broken carcass, and though her words were plain, they struck with the weight of undeniable truth. A ripple passed through the crowd, disbelief clashing with awe, and though some scoffed, muttering that it was impossible, others whispered to one another with eyes wide, for they knew her well enough to understand she would not invent such a claim. Cale's smile faltered for the briefest of moments, and in that crack she saw the truth. He feared the shift her words carried, the challenge to the order he had built on dominance and scorn. He demanded evidence, his tone sharp, accusing, as though her word alone could never be trusted. She did not argue, did not defend herself. Instead, she told him that the desert would show him soon enough, that scouts would find what remained of the machine before the next dawn, and when they did, their laughter would die as swiftly as the storm had. Her calm unsettled him more than anger ever could have, for it was not the voice of one seeking validation but of one who already possessed it. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the shifting of feet and the uneasy cough of someone in the back. Cale sneered, trying to turn the crowd back to his side, mocking the idea that she could have struck true in the storm, claiming that even seasoned warriors had failed where she now boasted success. Yet the words rang hollow, and though some nodded, many more hesitated, their doubt clear in the way they looked not at him but at her, searching for cracks in her calm and finding none. She held herself with quiet strength, her shoulders squared, her eyes steady, and in that poise lay a truth no jeer could erase. At last, Cale dismissed her with a wave, claiming he would wait for proof before wasting further breath, and turned away with the arrogance of one who could not bear to face the possibility of being wrong. But the damage was done. Seeds of doubt had been sown, and she knew that no matter how loudly he protested, the truth of her victory would grow roots. That night she sat alone in her quarters, the sounds of the outpost muted by heavy walls, and she let the exhaustion she had held at bay finally crash over her. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped the scarf from her face, her throat raw from the dust, her body aching from the long walk, yet beneath the weariness burned a fire that would not fade. She thought again of the storm, of the moment when everything had converged, and replayed the shot in her mind until it was etched deeper into her memory than any wound. She whispered her father's name softly, a prayer of gratitude to the man who had taught her to endure, and though the room was empty, she felt less alone than she had in years. Outside, the desert lay quiet beneath the stars, but she knew whispers were already spreading through the compound, whispers that carried her name with them. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, dreams of shifting sands and burning skies filled her mind, dreams where she stood again in the storm, her weapon steady, her breath calm, while laughter faded into silence. She woke before dawn, her body still weary but her spirit sharpened, and as the first light crept across the horizon, shouts rose outside the compound. She stepped into the courtyard to see scouts returning, their faces pale with disbelief, their voices carrying the news that the wreckage was real, that the machine lay broken in the desert exactly where she had said it would be. The crowd gathered quickly, murmurs swelling into cries of shock and awe, and though some still clung to doubt, the proof was undeniable. Eyes that had once dismissed her now followed her with something new, not yet respect but no longer contempt, and in their shifting gazes she saw the beginning of change. Cale stood apart, his face hard, his jaw clenched, and though he said nothing, she could see the storm gathering in him. She knew this was not the end of their conflict but only the first clash, and she steeled herself for the battles yet to come. The courtyard thrummed with restless energy, voices overlapping as scouts described what they had seen, the shattered machine half buried in the sand, its once graceful frame twisted and smoking as though the desert itself had swallowed it in rage, and every word only fueled the storm of disbelief and wonder that now spread through the compound. She stood among them silently, her hands folded before her, her face calm despite the stares pressing in from every side, and though no smile touched her lips, there was a light in her eyes that none could miss. The whispers carried her name like fire, darting from one corner of the crowd to another, and each retelling of her deed grew sharper, more certain, until even those who doubted could no longer dismiss it outright. Yet she did not bask in their shifting regard, for she knew how quickly awe could turn to envy, how swiftly admiration could sour into resentment, and so she held herself steady, refusing to give them more than the quiet truth of her presence. Cale lingered at the edge of the gathering, his jaw tight, his eyes burning with a fury he struggled to mask, and though he said nothing she could feel his hatred like heat radiating across the courtyard. He would not forgive her for this, not now, not ever, for her victory was a wound to his pride too deep to heal, and she knew in her bones that he would strike at her when the chance came. When the commander of the outpost finally stepped forward, his weathered face lit by the pale dawn, the crowd hushed at once, eager to hear his judgment. He was a man shaped by decades in the desert, his voice rough as gravel, his eyes hard as stone, and he had little patience for pride or boasting. He listened to the scouts, weighed their words with the care of one who had seen many false claims, then turned his gaze upon her. The silence stretched as he studied her, and though his expression revealed nothing, the weight of his regard pressed upon her like the storm itself. At last he spoke, not with praise but with simple acknowledgment, saying only that the desert had tested her and she had endured, that the wreckage proved her skill beyond question, and that none could deny the truth any longer. His words carried no warmth, yet in their stark simplicity lay the recognition she had sought for years, and though the crowd erupted again in murmurs, she bowed her head slightly, accepting the judgment without triumph. Cale stepped forward then, his voice sharp as a blade, demanding to know what this recognition meant, whether her single victory was enough to elevate her above seasoned warriors, whether the commander would allow her to walk among them as an equal now. His tone dripped with venom, each word carefully chosen to stir doubt, and though some in the crowd nodded, others shifted uneasily, reluctant to challenge what the desert itself had already confirmed. The commander silenced him with a raised hand, saying that equality was not given by decree but earned through continued proof, and that one victory did not end the trials to come. She listened to this without disappointment, for she had expected no sudden crown, no effortless rise. She knew the desert demanded endurance, not single moments of glory, and she was prepared to prove herself again and again if that was what it took. Cale's fury deepened at her calm, for he had hoped she would protest, that she would reveal arrogance he could exploit, but her silence robbed him of that weapon, leaving him with nothing but his own bitterness. Later, when the crowd dispersed, she found herself alone once more, sitting on the low wall that bordered the training ground, her weapon across her knees, her eyes watching the dunes beyond the compound. The sun climbed higher, washing the desert in pale gold, and though her body still ached, she welcomed the burn of fatigue, for it was proof that she had endured, that she had not broken. She thought of the path ahead, of the trials yet to come, and though doubt flickered at the edges of her mind, it could not root itself as it once had, for she carried the memory of the storm within her now, a shield against despair. She knew Cale would not rest, that he would scheme in shadows, twisting words and sowing poison where he could, and she prepared herself for that war of whispers, for she understood that blades were not the only weapons wielded in the outpost. Yet she also felt something stirring among the others, a quiet shift in the way they looked at her, not open respect yet, but no longer scorn, and in that subtle change she found strength. That evening she returned to the training ground long after most had left, and began her drills again, her body moving through the motions with practiced precision. She struck at invisible foes, her blade cutting arcs through the twilight air, her breath steady, her muscles burning, and though fatigue gnawed at her, she pressed on, for she knew that her enemies did not rest and neither could she. As the first stars appeared overhead, she sensed she was no longer alone, and when she turned she saw two younger recruits standing at the edge of the ground, watching her with wide eyes. They did not speak, but their presence was enough. They had come not to mock as others once had, but to learn, to see what discipline and persistence looked like. She said nothing, simply continued her drills, allowing them to watch, and when at last she lowered her blade, they bowed their heads slightly before slipping away into the night. That small gesture warmed her more than any cheer, for it meant the desert's lesson had reached further than her alone. But as the days passed, the tension with Cale grew sharper. He began to test her openly, challenging her in training bouts, twisting drills into contests, his strikes always heavier than necessary, his words laced with barbs meant to provoke. She met each challenge without complaint, parrying his blows, enduring his taunts, and though she bore bruises from his relentless assaults, she never gave him the satisfaction of faltering. Others began to notice, whispers rising that perhaps Cale feared her more than he hated her, for his need to break her had become an obsession. The commander, too, saw the pattern, but he did not intervene, perhaps believing that the desert would settle the matter in its own time, that storms must be allowed to rage before calm could return. One night, when the moon hung low and the outpost lay quiet, Cale confronted her directly, his voice low but dripping with venom. He told her she had humiliated him, that her victory had stained his honor, and that he would see her broken before he allowed her to rise above him. She met his threats with the same calm she had carried through the storm, telling him that his hatred was nothing to her, that the desert itself had judged between them and would do so again if need be. Her words only deepened his fury, his hands tightening into fists, and for a moment she thought he might strike her then and there, but he held himself back, his pride demanding a more public stage. He spat at her feet instead and walked away, his shadow long in the moonlight, and she knew that the true storm between them was yet to come. She returned to her quarters with her heart steady, unshaken by his threats, for she had faced worse storms than Cale's rage, and she would face him too when the time came. As she lay upon her bed, listening to the wind rattle the walls, she whispered again to the memory of her father, promising that she would not falter, that she would carry his lessons with her into every battle yet ahead. The desert was not finished with her, she knew, but neither was she finished with it, and whatever trials lay ahead, she would meet them with the same unyielding resolve that had carried her through the storm. The days that followed stretched tense and heavy, the air inside the outpost thick with an unease that no storm could wash away, for everyone could feel the silent war building between Kale and the woman who had silenced the desert's laughter. Whispers chased her footsteps wherever she went, voices asking whether she would truly rise higher, whether Kale would break her or be broken himself. And though no one spoke openly, all eyes watched, waiting for the inevitable clash. She kept to her routines, rising early to train before dawn, drilling herself until sweat drenched her clothes and her muscles screamed, for she knew Kale's attacks would not come only with words or fists but with the weight of public scrutiny. To meet him unprepared would be to hand him the victory he craved, so she honed herself with relentless discipline, each strike of her blade, each steady shot with her weapon, a promise to herself that she would not bend. The desert had already tested her and she had endured. Now it was the people who would become her storm. Kale's shadow loomed everywhere, his presence filling the training grounds with hostility, his laughter sharp and mocking whenever she passed, his voice always pitched loud enough for others to hear. He began to plant seeds among the recruits, telling them her victory was nothing more than luck, that the storm had blinded the machine, that she had stumbled into fortune she did not deserve. Some believed him or pretended to, for Kale's influence was strong, but others wavered, their doubt no longer as firm as it once had been, and in their hesitation he saw the danger of her growing strength. That danger festered in him like a wound, feeding his rage until he could no longer bear to wait for the desert's judgment. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sand in bloody light, Kale announced before the entire outpost that he would challenge her in the arena, a trial by combat sanctioned by tradition, where two warriors would face each other before their peers, their worth proven not by words but by steel. His voice rang out like a blade drawn from its sheath, and the crowd responded with a roar, half in excitement, half in dread, for such trials were rare and often ended in death. She did not flinch, did not look away but met his gaze with steady calm, and when he asked if she would accept, her answer was simple: yes. The courtyard fell silent, stunned by her lack of hesitation, and Kale's smile curved cruel, for he believed he had trapped her at last, that no matter how skilled she had proven in the storm, she could not stand against his brute strength in the arena. The commander's face was unreadable as he gave his assent, his voice carrying the weight of finality, declaring that the duel would take place at dawn 3 days hence, beneath the open sky where the desert itself would bear witness. That night she sat alone in her quarters, the weight of what lay ahead pressing upon her like stone, yet she did not despair. She thought of her father, of his words that storms were not enemies but teachers, and she reminded herself that Kale was nothing more than another storm to endure. He was stronger, heavier, trained to crush opponents with sheer force, but she had never relied on strength alone. Her power lay in patience, in clarity, in the discipline to wait for the precise moment when arrogance left an opening. She whispered these truths to herself as she polished her blade, as she checked the balance of her weapon, as she breathed deeply to steady her heart. Fear brushed against her mind, but she did not let it settle, for fear was the root Kale wanted to plant in her, the poison he relied on to break others before they even fought. She would not give him that victory. The days passed quickly, each hour filled with preparation. She trained from dawn to dusk, not to sharpen her body alone but to still her spirit, to anchor herself against the storm of Kale's fury. Others came to watch, recruits lingering at the edges of the training ground, their eyes wide with both fear and hope, and though she spoke little to them, her presence was a lesson stronger than any words. They saw the bruises on her arms, the calluses on her hands, the way she rose again and again no matter how her body ached, and some began to whisper not Kale's name but hers. Those whispers reached him, feeding his anger until it threatened to consume him, yet still she remained calm, for she had already walked through storms greater than his temper. At last dawn came, the sky streaked with crimson, the air heavy with silence as the outpost gathered around the arena. The circle of sand stretched wide, its edges marked by stones worn smooth from countless past duels, and as she stepped inside she felt the weight of history pressing upon her. Kale entered opposite, his figure broad and menacing, his armor gleaming, his blade heavy in his hand. His eyes burned with hatred, but beneath that fire she glimpsed something else, something sharp and desperate: fear. He masked it with arrogance, striding boldly, lifting his blade high for the crowd, but she saw through the mask, saw the crack in his spirit that her storm-born victory had carved. The commander raised his hand, his voice rough as he called for silence, then lowered it sharply to signal the beginning. Kale lunged at once, his strikes brutal, his blade crashing against hers with force that jarred her arms and rattled her bones, and the crowd roared with every clash. He sought to overwhelm her, to crush her beneath his strength before patience could betray him, but she did not meet force with force. She moved lightly, letting his weight drive him forward, parrying and sidestepping, her blade flashing in precise arcs that diverted his fury rather than resisting it. Each strike he delivered cost him energy, each miss stoked his rage, and though the crowd cheered his ferocity, some began to notice how she endured, how her calm never wavered. Sweat glistened on Kale's brow as the minutes dragged, his breath growing harsh, his swings wilder, and still she moved with steady rhythm, her eyes never leaving his, her patience unbroken. Then the moment came as she knew it would. Kale overextended, his blade slamming into the sand with a force that sent dust spraying, leaving his side open. In that heartbeat she struck, her blade cutting a clean line across his arm, not deep enough to kill but sharp enough to draw blood and shatter his rhythm. He staggered, fury twisting his face, but she did not relent, pressing forward now with precise strikes, each one measured, each one designed not to slaughter but to prove. The crowd gasped as Kale faltered, their voices rising in disbelief, and though he roared and swung wildly she parried with ease, her calm a wall he could not breach. At last, with one swift motion, she struck his blade aside and pressed her edge to his throat, the point poised just above his pulse, her eyes locked on his. Silence fell across the arena, broken only by the ragged sound of Kale's breath, and in that silence the truth was undeniable. She stepped back, lowering her blade, refusing to spill his blood despite the chance, and the crowd erupted, some in cheers, others in stunned disbelief. Kale fell to his knees, his pride shattered more completely than his body, and she stood tall above him, her breath steady, her eyes burning with the same fire that had carried her through the storm. The commander's voice rang out, declaring her the victor, and though Kale's followers shifted uneasily, none could deny the truth they had witnessed. She had not only survived the storm of dust and sun, but now the storm of man, and the desert itself seemed to echo her triumph in the whisper of wind across the arena. The aftermath of the duel rippled through the outpost like a tremor, reshaping alliances and silencing whispers, for no one could deny what their own eyes had seen, and though some still clung to Kale out of fear or pride, the weight of her victory pressed too heavily for their doubt to remain firm. She became not just the woman who cut down a moving target in a storm but now the warrior who had humbled Kale in the sacred arena, and that tale spread swiftly, carried on the lips of recruits and seasoned fighters alike, until it reached even the farthest corners of the desert where travelers and traders carried stories as readily as they carried goods. Yet victory, though sweet, brought with it a burden heavier than defeat, for eyes that once looked upon her with scorn now looked with expectation, waiting for her to embody the strength they had seen, waiting for her to prove it again and again in every test to come. She walked through the outpost with a calm expression, nodding to those who hailed her, offering only measured words, for inside she felt the weight of 1,000 unseen hands pressing her forward, and though she had weathered storms before, she knew this was a different kind, one not of sand or steel but of responsibility. Kale, broken in pride though still alive, became a shadow on the edges of the camp, his arm bound, his glare like a knife cutting through every space she entered. His followers, shaken, drifted away from him like leaves torn from a branch, yet his hatred only grew sharper, silent but venomous, his humiliation festering in silence, for a man who had built his identity upon dominance could not forgive the one who had stripped it away. He did not challenge her openly again, not yet, but she could feel his presence like a storm crouching at the horizon, waiting for the chance to break. Others, however, sought her out not in hatred but in hope, recruits who asked to train beside her, veterans who tested her with words of respect disguised as challenge, commanders who studied her with eyes that weighed potential against danger. She welcomed none too warmly, for trust was a fragile thing, but she did not push them away either, choosing instead to let her actions speak where words might falter. One evening as the sky turned to fire with the setting sun, the commander summoned her to his quarters, a rare summons that carried the gravity of command. She entered to find him seated by the map table, his eyes heavy with thought, the lines of age and leadership carved deep into his face. He regarded her for a long moment before speaking, his voice low, measured, carrying both praise and caution. He told her that the desert needed symbols, that in times of trial men and women did not merely follow strength but followed stories, and whether she liked it or not she had become one. Her storm-born victory, her triumph in the arena, these were tales already larger than life, and men would shape her into legend whether she agreed or not. Legends, he warned, brought as much danger as honor, for they drew envy, fear, and enemies from beyond. She listened in silence, her face calm though her heart stirred, for she had never sought to be a symbol, only to endure, only to prove that she had the right to stand where others said she could not. Yet the commander's words struck true, and she understood that the desert itself was now watching her, waiting to see what she would become. In the days that followed, small missions were entrusted to her, tasks that once would have been given only to the most seasoned, and she led with quiet precision, each success adding weight to her growing reputation. She guided patrols through shifting dunes, faced raiders who struck from the edges of the storm, and stood unyielding when others faltered, her calm in the heat of danger a balm that steadied the hearts of those around her. Slowly, recruits who once had mocked her began to look to her instinctively, their eyes searching her face in moments of crisis, and though she gave them little more than simple words of direction, they followed with newfound faith. The desert seemed to test her relentlessly, storms rising more often, dangers lurking in every horizon, yet with each trial she endured, her bond with the land and its people grew stronger. But Cale did not fade quietly. He lingered in the shadows, whispering poison into ears willing to listen, twisting her victories into warnings, claiming her rise threatened the order of their people. Some nodded, uneasy with the idea of a woman who broke traditions, fearful of change, and though their voices were quieter than before, she could feel their doubt like a thorn lodged beneath her skin. More than once she found small sabotages in her path, a weapon's edge dulled, a message delayed, a supply missing from its place. She said nothing, enduring silently, but she kept her eyes sharp and her senses alert, knowing that Cale's storm would return, fiercer for its patience. One night, when the desert lay cloaked in silence and stars, she walked alone beyond the outpost walls, her blade at her side, her thoughts heavy with the path she now walked. The sand stretched endless beneath the moonlight, the wind whispering like the voices of the past, and she thought of her father, of the teachings that had shaped her. Storms were not enemies but teachers, and every storm carried a lesson hidden within its rage. She asked herself what lesson this storm of people carried, what truth lay hidden beneath Cale's hatred and the commander's warning. The answer did not come easily, but as she gazed upon the vast horizon, she realized that perhaps the desert was showing her not just how to endure but how to lead, not just how to silence mockery but how to give others strength through her own. The thought filled her with both fear and clarity, for leadership was a heavier storm than any dust or blade, but she knew she could not turn away. When she returned to the outpost, dawn already brushed the sky with pale light, and as she stepped through the gates she saw faces waiting, recruits who had risen early to train with her, their eyes shining with anticipation. She did not speak grand words, did not lift her blade high or call herself a leader, but simply nodded and began the drills, her movements sharp and steady, her patience unbroken. They followed, and in their sweat and determination she saw the spark of something greater than herself beginning to take root. Cale might whisper, enemies might plot, the desert might rise with storms yet unseen, but she understood now that she was no longer walking for herself alone. Each step, each strike, each victory carried others with her, and that truth gave her a strength deeper than any she had known before. The weeks after her late-night realization brought no peace, only a tightening of threads that hinted at storms yet unseen, for though the recruits grew sharper under her guidance and the veterans began to accept her presence with grudging respect, Cale's shadow thickened across the outpost like gathering thunder. He no longer barked openly or hurled insults in crowded spaces, but his silence was more dangerous than his mockery had ever been, for silence bred suspicion, and men who once followed his laughter now leaned close to his whispers in the dark. She felt it in the air, that tension of a bowstring drawn but not released, and though she said nothing, though her face remained calm as stone, she prepared herself for the inevitable strike. Every time she sharpened her blade, every time she led recruits into the storm, she asked herself if this would be the moment Cale would turn the desert itself against her. Yet she did not falter, for to falter was to feed him the fear he so desperately wanted. The commander saw it too, though he did not name Cale directly, only spoke to her in private of enemies within who feared change more than they feared raiders beyond the dunes. He told her to be wary, to guard her steps, for storms within a camp were the ones most likely to tear it apart. She nodded, listening without protest, but in her heart she had already accepted that Cale's hatred would not end until one of them was broken beyond repair. The desert was vast enough to swallow pride, yet Cale clung to his like a drowning man to driftwood, and she knew such desperation would lead him to risk everything. Her days became a careful balance of leadership and vigilance, her nights restless, her hand never far from the hilt of her blade, her ears alert to the faintest disturbance. The breaking point came not in the outpost walls but far beyond them, on a patrol deep into the dunes where the wind screamed like a living thing and the horizon burned with red dust. She had been sent with a dozen recruits and 2 seasoned fighters to scout the edges where raiders had been reported, and though the desert shifted beneath their feet with every step, her calm steadied them, guiding them through the storm. Yet as the sun dipped and shadows lengthened, they came upon a canyon where the wind carried an unnatural silence, and she felt in her bones that something was wrong. The recruits moved uneasily, hands tightening on their weapons, but before she could turn them back, figures rose from the sand like phantoms, raiders armed and ready, their ambush laid perfectly in wait. The fight erupted in chaos, steel flashing, shouts echoing against the canyon walls, dust blinding eyes and clogging throats, but through it all she moved with the same precision she had shown in the arena, her strikes measured, her commands sharp, steadying the recruits who might otherwise have broken. It was then she saw him, Cale, standing among the raiders, his face twisted with triumph and rage, for he had done the unthinkable, betraying his own to strike her down. He roared her name across the canyon, his blade lifted high, and in that instant she understood that the whispers, the sabotage, all had led to this. A storm not of nature, not of rivalry but of treachery. Her heart pounded, not with fear but with fury, for Cale had crossed beyond pride into betrayal, endangering their people for the sake of his vengeance. She met his charge with calm steel, parrying his blow even as the world around them dissolved into chaos, recruits fighting for their lives, raiders pressing hard, dust swirling so thick it seemed the desert itself had risen to watch. Cale's strength was as brutal as ever, each strike heavy enough to rattle her bones, but she no longer fought him alone. Behind her she felt the eyes of the recruits, the weight of their trust, and it gave her a steadiness deeper than any storm. The battle raged long and hard, the canyon floor slick with sweat and blood, the cries of the dying mingling with the shriek of wind, and through it all she endured, her blade flashing like lightning in the storm. One by one, the recruits began to fight not with fear but with resolve, holding their ground beside her, their voices rising in defiance, and the tide began to turn. Raiders who had expected easy prey found themselves pressed back, their ambush unraveling beneath the stubborn will of those they sought to crush. Cale fought like a man possessed, his eyes wild, his strikes reckless, but she waited, patient even in the fury, until his desperation betrayed him once more. He lunged with a roar, blade swinging wide, and she slipped aside, her strike clean and precise, cutting deep across his leg and sending him crashing to the sand. The raiders faltered at the sight, their leader brought low, and the recruits surged with renewed strength, driving them back until the canyon echoed with retreating footsteps and the wind carried silence once more. She stood over Cale, her blade poised, his eyes burning with hate even as blood soaked the sand beneath him, and for a long moment she considered ending it, ending the storm of his betrayal once and for all. But she lowered her blade, just as she had in the arena, refusing to let his hatred dictate her hand. Instead she bound his wounds, ordering 2 recruits to drag him back, for his crime was not hers to judge alone. It belonged to the outpost, to the commander, to the desert itself. Cale spat curses, his voice hoarse with rage, but she did not respond, her silence heavier than any blade. When they returned to the outpost, battered but alive, the commander's face darkened as he saw Cale bound among them, and the truth spilled quickly from the recruits' lips, their voices shaking with outrage as they told of betrayal. The camp erupted with fury, voices rising against Cale, demanding justice, some even calling for blood. The commander raised his hand, silencing them, and declared that Cale would face trial at dawn, judged not by whispers or pride but by the law of their people. The recruits cheered her name then, not just in victory but in gratitude, their voices carrying across the outpost like a tide she could not stop, and for the first time she felt the full weight of what she had become. Not just a survivor, not just a warrior, but a leader. That night she stood alone once more, the stars burning above her, the desert stretching endless and vast, and she thought of the storms that had shaped her. She had faced dust and sun, ridicule and scorn, blades and betrayal, and through it all she had endured. Tomorrow Cale would face judgment, but already she understood the lesson this storm had carried. That strength was not in the steel of a blade or the roar of a crowd, but in the patience to endure, the clarity to lead, and the choice to rise above hatred even when hatred begged for blood. She breathed deeply, the desert wind cool against her skin, and though storms yet waited beyond the horizon, she knew she would not face them alone. The dawn came sharp and cold, the desert washed in pale gold as if the land itself wished to bear witness to what would unfold, and the outpost gathered in the central square where judgment would be given. Cale was dragged forward, his wounds bound but his spirit unbroken, his eyes burning with the same fire that had driven him to betrayal. He stood defiant even in chains, spitting curses, his voice raw as he declared that he had only done what the desert demanded, that her rise was a poison threatening to unmake their people, that he was the last defender of the order they had lived by. The crowd hissed and jeered, some shouting for his blood, others simply watching with grim faces, for though Cale had lost his followers, his words still struck at old fears, the fear of change, the fear of tradition broken. She stood among them, silent, her face calm though inside her heart ached, for she knew that this was not just Cale's judgment but the outposts', a test of whether they would cling to the past or embrace the storms that carried them forward. The commander raised his hand, his voice carrying across the square with the weight of law. He spoke of Cale's betrayal, of his choice to side with raiders against his own people, of the blood spilled and the danger wrought, and his words left no doubt of the crime. Yet he did not call for Cale's death, instead asking the gathered voices what judgment they would give, for justice in their ways was not handed down from one but spoken by the many. A silence followed, heavy and uncertain, broken only by the shifting of feet and the low murmur of voices, until at last the recruits she had led into the storm cried out together that Cale had forfeited his place among them, that he should be cast out, stripped of his name, exiled to the desert he had betrayed. Others joined, voices rising, until the square thundered with the sound of exile, and Cale's face twisted with something between rage and terror, for even death was kinder than being left nameless in the endless sands. The commander's eyes were hard as stone as he gave the final decree. Cale would be exiled at sunset, left with nothing but the clothes on his back, and the desert would decide his fate. The square erupted in sound, some cheering, others weeping, and Cale roared curses until his voice broke, his chains rattling as he fought against them. She did not move, did not speak, only met his gaze when he turned it on her, his hatred burning brighter than the sun, and in that moment she felt the weight of what had been decided. She had not asked for this, had not wanted to be the one who toppled him, yet his path and hers had collided until no other end was possible. When the crowd dispersed, when Cale was dragged back to his holding, she remained in the square alone, staring at the horizon where the desert shimmered, and she whispered a prayer not for herself but for him, that he might find some fragment of peace even in exile. As the day stretched toward its fiery end, she trained as always, her body moving through the familiar rhythm of drills, though her mind drifted with every strike. The recruits gathered around her, their faces set with determination, their loyalty clear in the way they mirrored her movements, and she understood that her place among them had been sealed. She was no longer an outsider, no longer the girl mocked for daring to stand among warriors. She was their anchor, their storm-born guide, and though the weight pressed heavy on her shoulders, she bore it with quiet strength. When the sun began to fall, painting the desert in blood-red light, the outpost gathered once more at the gates to watch Cale's exile. He was brought forth, his chains removed, his weapons taken, his name stripped from the rolls, and the commander spoke the final words that cut him free from their people. Cale stood trembling with fury, his eyes locked on her, and though his mouth twisted with curses, his voice cracked, betraying the fear he could no longer hide. Then he was pushed beyond the gates, and the desert swallowed him as the sun slipped beneath the horizon, leaving only silence in his wake. The crowd lingered, hushed, as if the desert itself held its breath, and then their voices rose, not in cheers but in a low, steady chant of her name. It was not triumph they gave her, but recognition, a bond forged in storms and blood, a vow that they would walk beside her into whatever trials came next. She felt their voices wash over her, not lifting her above them but binding her to them, and in that bond she found the strength to breathe again. The commander approached, his face grave yet softened by something close to pride, and he told her that the desert had chosen, that though storms might rise again, she had proven herself not just a warrior but a leader. She bowed her head, accepting not with pride but with humility, for she knew that leadership was not a crown but a burden, and the storms ahead would demand more of her than any blade ever could. That night the stars burned brighter than she had ever seen, the desert stretched vast and endless, and she stood upon the walls, her eyes scanning the horizon where Cale had vanished. She thought of the path that had brought her here, from the dust storm where she had cut down a moving target as the sun fell, to the arena where she had humbled her rival, to the canyon where betrayal had nearly destroyed them all. Each storm had taught her, each trial had shaped her, until she stood not just as a survivor but as something greater, and though fear still brushed against her heart, it no longer ruled her. She breathed the desert wind, cool and sharp, and felt within it the voices of those who had walked before, warriors who had endured storms of their own, their lessons carried in the sand and the stars. She closed her eyes and whispered to them that she understood now, that storms were not meant to be fled or fought alone, but endured together, and in that understanding she felt the desert itself settle within her bones. When morning came, she rose with the recruits, her blade in hand, her movements steady, her patience unbroken. They followed her not because of fear or command but because they chose to, because in her they saw not just strength but endurance, not just victory but hope. The desert would rise again with storms, enemies would come and doubt would whisper in shadows, but she was ready. She had walked through laughter, through scorn, through blood and betrayal, and had emerged not untouched but unbroken. As the sun climbed high, casting long shadows across the sand, she lifted her blade once more, and in that moment the desert itself seemed to bow, as if acknowledging not a legend born of chance but a woman who had earned her place beneath its endless sky. The end.